Good evening, everyone. Good evening, Berlin. Good evening, Chrisville. Good to see you all. We're super excited to get started. Who's ready for Exodus? Woo! If you haven't grabbed a packet yet, make sure you grab that. That is the Robert Alter translation that I used a lot in my Genesis class, and I'm going to be using a lot in this class. And the reason why I decided to go that route is we're going to be doing, this class is a literary reading of the central text of the Torah. So because it's a literary reading, we're going to be in the text a lot. So I want to make sure that you have the text that I'm reading from, rather than going, I have no idea where he's at right now. And the reason I chose this translation in particular is this translation is a lot closer to the original Hebrew. And in doing that, some of the sentence structure you'll notice is not normal as our sentence structure. A perfect example is almost every single paragraph starts with the word and, which is not how you ever write in English, but that's how you write in Hebrew. So we're gonna have fun getting through this as we go through Exodus. So you can go ahead and turn either in, you can also use your regular Bible and turn there as well if you want to see side to side, but we're gonna be on page 1, which is chapter 1. That's how we're gonna begin. But as we go through, I'm called this a literary reading of the central text of the Torah, because Exodus really is the central text of not just the Torah, but the entire Tanakh, the entire Jewish scriptures. Exodus is really the central text. This is the text in which God moves from just making promises to bringing his people and claiming his people as his own, as well as the Israelites claiming God as their God. And this is a very important text. In fact, if you have ever read the Gospel of Matthew or go through that, he cannot get away from Exodus imagery because it's so prevalent in their faith. And Matthew's writing to the Jews his gospel, so it makes sense that he focuses on Exodus because it's that important. For our weekly schedule, we're going to start this week in the first 4 chapters looking at the Israelites while they are enslaved in Egypt. The next week, we'll look at the 10 plagues. Then week 3, we'll look at the 10 words. That's a little of a nugget that I'll let you chew on until we get there. Then we'll look at God's glory, and then we'll look at the law. And that's where we're going to be for this class. Now, in this class, I want to preface it with this. We are doing a literary reading, which means we're not really going to be covering a ton of theology necessarily. So I'm going to have what I call a basic theology of Exodus that I'm going to sort of be starting with. So what I'd like is, I know this is hard for some people, but as we look at this literarily, I'd like it if we could just take our preconceptions, put them in a box, and just slide them to the side for a second so that we can read the text without any other outside things coming in going, wait a second, let's read the text for what it is, and then I promise you this isn't really going to change, but there are going to be some things that make you think. And rather than just shutting it down because, well, wait, I'd rather you focus on what the text is saying, and then it will make sense, I promise, as we go through. So the basic theology that I'm going to be starting with is, number 1, there is a God. And everyone's like, whew, good. All right, so there is a God, and this God commands obedience. But as we see in Exodus, man disobeys God's commands. And in response, God corrects man to help him repent. That's the basic theology framework that we're going to be starting from as we read this narrative. And as we looked at with Genesis, we noticed that Genesis was a biblical narrative. This is also a biblical narrative, but this is what I like to call a penitential narrative. Now, I was debating using that big word, but I couldn't find a better word without using 6. So I decided to just give you an explanation of what a penitential narrative is. A penitential narrative is a narrative of penance to turning back to God. So it's basically the idea of repenting and penance to then obedience. Does that make sense? So it's this idea of we are repenting from this and we are changing our ways and then obeying and going in this direction. That's what a penitential narrative is. And Exodus is a penitential narrative. However, a lot of us think of it as a penitential narrative just for the Israelites. I would make the argument that as we go forward, you're going to start to see that this is a dual penitential narrative. The first part is clear. How do we get the Israelites to turn back to God? That's easy. That's simple. But I'd even make the argument that it's also for the Egyptians. And the question is, can God convince the Egyptians and even Pharaoh to stop and turn back to him? Can he gather a foreign nation to believe in him? And you're going to notice as we go through and we look at this literarily, we're going to see a lot of things where God is really reaching out to the Egyptians saying, come on, come to me. Remember, God isn't just a God of the Israelites, he's a God of all nations. And he's trying to call them to himself. And this is where we start to see this happening. And we're going to see, obviously, Pharaoh be against it. But we are going to see throughout the text some Egyptians that start to follow God's way and recognize who he is. And we're going to be talking about that as we go through this. So let's go ahead and start in verse 1. Again, we're going to be doing a lot of reading. There aren't verses in there, but you'll find it pretty quickly because the sentence structure, as awkward as it is, it's kind of easy to find where you are once you see the phrasing. So, verse 1. And these are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob. Each man with his household they came. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. And all these persons springing from the loins of Jacob were 70 persons, but Joseph was in Egypt. And Joseph died, and all his brothers with him, and all that generation. Now, that beginning couple verses is very much just a normal expansion literary trope that's used constantly throughout the Bible. It's just saying, we're moving on from where we were, let's get to where we are. We're sort of setting the scene. Now, let's remember the scene, though. How did Genesis end? And I'll read it for you. In Genesis chapter 50, last verse, verse 26, and Joseph died, 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. This is very important because we see right from the get-go, Joseph dies at 110, and we talked about this in the last class, an Egyptian number. 11 is a fullness perfection number in Egyptian, while 12 is a fullness number in Hebrew and Judaism. But he dies at 110. And what that's signifying, the reader, is we're about to move into an Egyptian narrative. We're about to move into a foreign land. And that's where we are right now. We're in Egypt, right? And at the end, in Deuteronomy, at the very end of Deuteronomy, which we're not going to cover in this class, but at the very end of Deuteronomy, chapter 34, verse 7, and Moses was 120 years old when he died. And that's showing you he died at the perfect age for a Jew as they're about to go into the promised land. We're about to go back into this realm of teaching. This is what's happening within the scripture, is these subtle clues are showing the reader, where are we about to go? Where are we headed? With Joseph, he dies, perfect Egyptian age. We're about to enter into Egypt, and we're going to be talking very much, this narrative is going to be very Egyptian focused. But then when Moses dies, he dies at the perfect Jewish age. We're about to go into the promised land. Joshua, Yeshua, God's salvation, is about to bring us into the promised land, and things are about to change. And these are the little tropes that sometimes we miss when we don't look at it from a literary perspective. So let's continue. And all that generation, and the sons of Israel were fruitful and swarmed and multiplied and grew very vast, and the land was filled with them. This sentence, right after the introduction, is meant to give us echoes of Genesis. It swarmed, it multiplied, they're fruitful, it teemed, there was life, fruitfulness. And if you remember in Genesis, there was a very big problem in Genesis. The call was to be fruitful, and yet we saw a big issue with barrenness. A lot of barrenness mentioned in Genesis that then led to fruitfulness in God. But here, the Jewish people are enslaved and imprisoned, and they are beyond fruitful, right? We're now in this place where they are crazy fruitful, and we're going to see that in a couple verses. We're also going to see some creaturely imagery with the Israelites. I know I just said the Israelites, and I'll explain this, because we're going to start seeing some inside and outside perspectives. I encourage you with your sheet, whenever you see the word Hebrews or Israelites, to either underline it, circle it, or highlight it. You're going to see this a lot. You're going to see two different perspectives being shown, an inside and an outside perspective. The outside perspective is the Egyptian perspective. Whenever the Egyptians are either being talked to about the Israelites, God's people, or they are talking to them, they're going to talk Hebrews, which always has some sort of animal imagery to it. It's almost like they're Hebrews. They're like animals. That's how they view them. And so whenever you see Hebrews, you know we're talking either to Pharaoh, or or Egyptians are talking about the Jewish people. But the inside perspective, you're going to see Israelites. And that always has a very a human perspective, and not just a human perspective, but a relational perspective with it. And that's usually God talking to his people and about his people. So we're going to see those two things. So if you ever see those, underline them, circle them, highlight them, and take a look at the context around the sentences, and you'll see, oh, here we're talking about to Pharaoh, here we're talking to the Jews, and you're going to see the difference between them. Look at verse 8. And a new king arose over Egypt, who knew not Joseph, and he said to his people, underline his people. There are going to be a bunch of things you're going to see here. You're going to see his people, your people, this people, my people. Anytime you see that, make some sort of mark, because this is what's happening all throughout Exodus. There's this pushing and pulling of relationship. Is this people? Is it my people? Is it your people? What kind of people are they? And it always ties directly to obedience. And we're going to see that as we go throughout Exodus. And we're going to see God talking this way. We're going to see Moses talking this way. We're going to see the Pharaoh talking this way. We're going to see this pushing and pulling all throughout the narrative. I know that's a lot, but let's continue. Next verse. And he said to his people, look, the people of the sons of Israel is more numerous and vaster than we. Come, let us be shrewd with them, lest they multiply. And then, should war occur, they will actually join our enemies and fight against us and go up from the land. And they set over them forced labor foremen, so as to abuse them with their burdens. And they built store cities for Pharaoh, Pithom and Ramses. And as they abused them, so did they multiply, and so did they spread, and they came to loathe the Israelites. I love that last part. And so they abused them, and so did they multiply, and so did they spread. What you see here is that the more you abuse the Israelites, the more fruitful they become. The more you mess with them, the more God's going to bless them. And that actually goes all the way back to Genesis, in Genesis chapter 16. When you see Hagar in the wilderness after being abused by Sarai, and she runs into the wilderness, and the Lord's messenger comes and says, where are you going? Where have you come from? Where are you going? And she says, I'm fleeing my mistress, right? And what does the Lord's messenger say to her in verses 9 and 11? For the Lord has heeded your suffering. Return to your mistress and suffer abuse at her hand. The Lord has heeded your suffering. Now go suffer. That's a very, very hard thing to hear. But there's something about suffering that brings people to trust God more. And it builds perseverance, and it builds us in our faith. And that's what's happening here. The Jewish people, the Israelites, are in tremendous suffering, and the Lord is going to allow them to remain in that suffering to a certain point. And then he's going to bring them out, just as he did with Hagar. And we're going to see that. So we just read verses 7 to 12. Let's pick up at verse 13, this second column here. And the Egyptians put the Israelites to work at crushing labor. Remember, suffering, all right? And they made their lives bitter with hard work, with mortar and bricks and every work in the field, all their crushing work that they performed. And the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, Hebrew, king of Egypt, this is a Egyptian perspective, to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Sifra and the other named Puah. And he said, when you deliver the Hebrew women and look on the birth stool, if it is a boy, you shall put him to death. And if it is a girl, she may live. And the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt had spoken to them, and they let the children live. So, something very interesting here in these verses. In the latter part, what do we see? Work, work, work. And what do we see in the previous verses? Multiply, multiply, multiply. The more they suffer, the more they multiply. And also, we see the midwives feared God. There is going to be a struggle here. Who do you fear? Who will you serve? God or Pharaoh? Pharaoh sees himself as a god. Who are you going to serve? And the Hebrew midwives chose to fear God. And because they fear God, the fear of God leads to obedience, which then leads to stopping and turning back to God. That's the penitential narrative right there. That's the idea. And it's actually really interesting because if you look at the Old Testament, fear the Lord, fear God, fear the Lord, it's written over 150 times. And over half of those times is in the Psalms by David. The fear of the Lord is so important because the fear of the Lord is what brings you to obedience. It's what drives you to stop and turn back and repent. And I think far too often we miss the fear of the Lord in our lives. And that's something that this narrative is trying to teach us. Now, the fear of the Lord that they have led to obedience. Look at verse 17. And the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt had spoken to them, and they let the children live. Now let's continue. And the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, "Why do you do this thing and let the children live?" And the midwives said to Pharaoh, I love this. This is actually, by the way, a joke, so you can laugh at the end, whether or not you get it. For not like the Egyptian women or the Hebrew women, for they are hardy. Before the midwife comes to them, they give birth. Now, this Hebrew word hardy is hayot. Hayot denotes an animalistic quality. They are like animals. That's what they're saying. This is what you want to hear, right? The Hebrews are like animals. You treat them like animals. They're like animals. They get birth before we can even get there. They're not like the Egyptian women. It's a joke. It's like he thinks they're like animals. But anyway. That did not go through well. All right, so Chrisfield, you got it. All right, so this is what's happening. And they use this excuse. Now, as we know, after this, Pharaoh then goes and he gives a command to the entirety of Egypt, not just the Hebrew midwives, kill any of the baby boys that are born. Which leads us to chapter 2. Go to chapter 2, starting in the first verse. And a man from the house of Levi went and took a Levite daughter. Notice that, Levite daughter. We're talking about what's going to be the priestly line. All right? At the end here, Moses and Aaron are from the priestly line, right? And a woman conceived and bore a son, and she saw that he was goodly, and she hid him 3 months. And when she could no longer hide him, she took a wicker ark for him and caulked it with resin and pitch and placed the child in it and placed it in the reeds by the banks of the Nile. There's a lot here, so let's take a second. All right, let's park here for a second. This passage is meant to be reminiscent of the flood in Genesis. It's meant to bring you back to that imagery of what happened in the flood. He's placed in an ark. He's in the water. And what happened during the flood? Destruction of the world, which led to Noah and his family being a remnant. This is meant to tell you there's about to be a destruction, and there will be a remnant. It's not the destruction of the world, rather we're about to see the destruction of Egypt. And then Israelites will be the remnant that are brought out. This is what this imagery is meant to show you. It's trying to foreshadow what's about to happen. It's trying to tell you, remember the flood? Similar things about to happen. Destruction's about to come, but there will be a remnant. So, another thing is he's placed in the reeds. Interesting. This is a Hebrew word that's yam suf. Say yam suf. Yam suf. Let me ask you this question. A little trivia. Let's see if you know if you're there. When Moses, well, I'm just going to say, I'm not trying to trick you. Moses, God's power through him, parted the Red Sea. Parted the sea. Which sea did he part? I just gave you the answer. Which sea did he part?
Red Sea.
Ooh. Ooh, no, the Sea of Reeds. See, this is a mistranslation. It's actually known. It's actually in your Bibles, usually written out at the bottom. Yam Suf means Sea of Reeds or the Sea of Rushes. It's not the Red Sea. But it doesn't really matter except for the fact that it's meant to tie you back to this. Moses was placed among the reeds, and then he's going to be drawn out. Just as the Israelites are about to go into the Sea of Reeds and be drawn out. That's what it's trying to do. It's trying to tell you what's about to happen. There's a foreshadow of what's about to happen. We're also going to see a lot of water imagery in Exodus. We're going to see the plague of the Nile in Exodus chapter 7. We're going to see the crossing of the Sea of Reeds or the Sea of Rushes in Exodus 14. We're going to see the bitter waters in the wilderness in Exodus 15. And we're going to see the water from the rock in Exodus 17. There's a lot of water imagery. And as we get to those chapters, we'll talk a little bit more about that. A lot of water imagery. Let's continue. That was a lot for just 3 verses, right? But let's continue. Verse 4. And his sister stationed herself at a distance to see what would be done to him. And Pharaoh's daughter came down to bathe in the Nile, her maidens walking along the Nile. And she saw the ark amidst the reeds and sent her slave girl and took it. And she opened it up and saw a child, and look, it was a lad weeping. And she pitied him and said, this is one of the children of the Hebrews. Underline. Wait a minute. Bithiah, who is Pharaoh's daughter, Bithiah notices that this is a Hebrew child. What's she going to do? Her father's made it very clear. Jewish boys are to be killed. So what does she do? And his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and summon a nursing woman from the Hebrews that she may suckle the child for you? Pharaoh's daughter said to her, go. And the girl went and summoned the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, carry away this child and suckle him for me, and I myself will pay your wages. Why you yourself? This has to be a secret. This is against the law right now. But I have pity for this child. I realize that Pharaoh is wrong, and I want to save this child. And the woman took the child and suckled him, which is his own mother. That's great. And the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became a son to her. And she called his name Moses, for from the water I drew him out. Now, names, very important, right? Here's the thing about Moses. Moses has 2 meanings. Moses has 2 meanings. It either means he who draws out or he who is drawn out. He who draws out or he who is drawn out. And we're going to see this with Moses. There's this wrestle within Moses. Am I to draw people out, or is God trying to draw me out? There is this wrestle in his being, and we're going to see this as we continue through the narrative, how I guess you could say his character arch changes. And we're going to see a lot of that today, like the beginning to where we know he's going to be. There's this wrestle within him from his name from the very beginning. Look at verse 11. And it happened at that time that Moses grew up and went out to his brothers and saw their burdens. And he saw an Egyptian man striking a Hebrew man of his brothers, and he turned this way and that and saw that no man was about, and he struck down the Egyptian and buried him in the sand. You might say, well, that's pretty straightforward. He killed a guy, right? But here's the thing. What does it mean he looked this way and then he looked that way? The common interpretation that we've all heard is he wanted to see if anyone else was watching before he killed the guy. And that's not a bad interpretation, but I think there might be something more here. Something more that actually falls in line with who Moses is and his character. I would argue that rather than to see if anyone else was watching, Moses was looking to see if anyone else was going to do something. He hesitated. And we're going to see a lot of hesitation in Moses. He has a lot of hesitation when God says, go do it. And he goes, are you sure? Moses, you should, I don't know. He's constantly hesitating and not confident and bold. And that's what we see within him, this hesitation. And I would argue that the Jewish understanding would lead more towards him saying, is anyone else going to do something? Is God drawing me out to do this? Or am I to stay, what do I do? And he's that inner wrestle within the text. Continue to verse 13. And he went out the next day, and look, 2 Hebrew men were brawling. So he comes out, there's an Egyptian man beating a Hebrew man, and then the next day he comes out and there's 2 Hebrew men brawling. You see this? Kind of similar. However, he said to the one in the wrong, "Why should you strike your fellow?" And he said, "Who set you as a man prince and judge over us? Is it to kill me that you mean as you killed the Egyptian?" And Moses was afraid, and he thought, "Surely the thing has become known." And Pharaoh heard of this thing, and he sought to kill Moses. And Moses fled from Pharaoh's presence and dwelled in the land of Midian, and he sat down by the well. Let's take a look at this. First off, who set you as a man prince and judge over us? This is kind of ironic, because God's about to set him as a man prince and judge over Israel, but not yet. That's the first thing. There's a little bit of a foreshadowing of what's to come. He's struggling with what his role really is. What am I called to do? But then finally, he sat down by the well in Midian. Does anyone remember what happened at wells in Genesis? What happened at wells? There were 2 well scenes in Genesis. Betrothal scenes. Jacob and Rachel, Isaac and Rebekah, and now Moses and Zipporah. Being at a well in the Old Testament tended to talk about a betrothal scene. And here's the thing, each betrothal scene tells you something very important about the people at the scene. It really gives you a peer into who they were and who they are. And look what happens here in verse 16. And the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock, and the shepherds came and drove them off. And Moses rose and saved them and watered their flock. Whoa, whoa, whoa. The one who is hesitant now rises up and saves. You can see the potential that God sees in Moses. You have the ability, Moses, to rise up and save, which is what I want to draw out of you, but you're so hesitant and not bold. And I need to work on that with you. This is what God's trying to get out of Moses. He sees the potential that he obviously is given to him at birth, and he goes, but you're letting things get in the way. He flees from murdering the Egyptian. He hesitates, but now here he rises up to save the women. And we see this inner struggle in Moses as he's trying to wrestle through, what am I supposed to be? What am I supposed to do? Let's look at verse 18 as we continue. And they came to Reuel, their father, and he said, why have you hurried back today? Because it came back so fast. And they said, an Egyptian man rescued us. Notice that. They know he's Egyptian. Moses right now was living in Pharaoh's court. He's got a shaved head. He's wearing Egyptian clothes. He doesn't look like a Jewish person. He looks like an Egyptian. And he rescued us from the hands of the shepherds. And what's more, he even drew water for us and watered the flock. Betrothal scene, Rachel and Joseph. Joseph goes and waters her flock. Isaac and Rebekah waters all the camels, crazy. And now here, Moses goes and waters the flock. So we see a lot of parallelism happening, some repetition. And he said to his daughters, and where is he? Why did you leave the man? Call him that he may eat bread. And Moses agreed to dwell with the man. And he gave Zipporah his daughter to Moses, and she bore a son, and he called his name Gershom, for he said, a sojourner have I been in a foreign land. And it happened when a long time had passed that the king of Egypt died, and the Israelites groaned from the bondage and cried out, and their plea from the bondage went up to God. And God heard their moaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And God saw the Israelites, and God knew. Underline that. And God knew. This is the exact same word that is used when it talks about Abraham knew Eve. It's saying there's an intimate relationship. God has a relationship with his people. He knows. He hears their groanings. He knows their suffering. And when they've cried out, he goes, your suffering is now at an end. I told you, I've heeded your suffering, now go suffer. And now I'm going to remove that suffering because the time has come. Look at chapter 3, verse 1. And Moses was herding the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, priest of Midian. And he drove the flock into the wilderness and came to the mountain of God, to Horeb. And the Lord's messenger appeared to him in a flame of fire from the midst of the bush. And he saw, and look, the bush was burning with fire, and the bush was not consumed. Whoa. Some people say this is so God. So powerful and just like can't even be consumed, can't be contained. Just beyond anything you could imagine. Look further. And Moses thought, let me pray, turn aside that I may see this great sight. Why the bush does not burn up? And the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, and God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Hineni. Remember that? Hineni. Here I am, fully in your presence. Here I am. And God said, he said, come no closer here. Take off your sandals from your feet, for the place you are standing on is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. Underline that, afraid to look upon God. It's sort of ironic because now here in chapter 3, he's afraid to look upon God. But in Exodus chapter 33, he desires to see all of God's glory. And God goes, I can't show you my face. You can see the back of my cloak. But do you see the character arch from hesitation, from fearfulness to boldness? This is where Moses is going to end up because he starts trusting in God as he moves forward. Verse 7. And the Lord said, I indeed have seen the abuse of my people, underline, that is in Egypt, and its outcry because of its taskmasters. I have heard, for I know its pain, and I have come down to rescue it from the hand of Egypt. Hand of Egypt. Go ahead and circle that. Hand of Egypt. You're going to see a lot of hand imagery as well. A lot of hand imagery in this book. And bring it up from the land to be a goodly and spacious land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanite and the Hittite and the Amorite and the Perizzite and the Hivite and the Jebusite. It's a lot. But land flowing with milk and honey. Now, we talked about this in our first class. And if you weren't there, don't worry, I won't expect you to randomly just know the information. Land flowing with milk and honey is talking about the type of land they're going to come to. Honey is talking about fertile land. So like the flowers and then the honeybees and you get honey. It's the fertile land. While milk is what you get from the donkeys and the goats. And they are in the wilderness, the desert. So what God is saying is I'm taking you to a land where fertile land and desert meet. That's the land of milk and honey. And it just so happens to be the land of these people that are already there. And we know when we get to Joshua, there's going to be a conquest of the land that God has given them. Let's continue. And now, look, the outcry of the Israelites, inside perspective, has come to me. And I have also seen the oppression of which the Egyptians oppressed them. And now, go that I may send you to Pharaoh and bring my people, the Israelites, a lot of underlining, out of Egypt. Look at Moses' response. So God's like, I'm ready. It's time. I'm going to bring them out. And look what Moses says. Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and that I should bring the Israelites from Egypt? Moses, God's bringing them out. This is where we have this struggle. Whose people are these? Yes, they're God's people, but you're going to constantly see Moses confuse this. And Moses is going to talk about them as his people at certain times. And other times he's going to say, no, God, they're your people. And then God's going to go, well, actually, they got me really mad now. They're your people now. Any of you have kids, right? That kid that spills something like milk all over the place, and you go, that's your child, right? That's sort of the same thing. There's going to be this wrestle in the passage of whose people. And Moses isn't getting it. Look at verse 12. He says, who will bring me out of Egypt? And God said, he said, for I will be with you. And this is the sign for you that I myself have sent you. Now, this is important. What's the sign? The sign we just missed. Underline, I will be. I will be. Church, that's God's name. Ayah. And we'll talk about that in a second. Ayah. This is the word that God uses. He says, Ayah asher ayah. I am who I am. I will be what I will be. I will be there howsoever I will be there. This is his name. I will be. This is the sign. Me. For I myself have sent you. When the people come out from Egypt, you shall worship God on this mountain. And Moses said to God, look, when I come to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they say, what is his name? What shall I say to them? And God said to Moses, Ayah asher ayah. I will be who I will be. Now, I am who I am. I will be who I will be. These are acceptable translations, okay? I prefer a different translation because I feel these are too, I don't know the right word other than metaphysical. They're not relational. I prefer the phrase, I will be there howsoever I will be there. It's this relational, I'm going to be there with you. I will be there with you. Howsoever I will be there, I am with you in this. And that's what God's trying to say. He's trying to say, I will be there no matter what. However I am, I'll be there. And he said, thus shall you say to the Israelites, Ayah has sent me to you. And you might say, Pastor Mike, I thought God's name was Yahweh. What's going on? Don't worry, we're getting there. All right? And God said further to Moses, thus shall you say to the Israelites, the Lord God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob sent me to you. This is my name forever, and thus am I invoked in all ages. Now, there's something really awesome happening here. God says to Moses, either I am who I am, I will be who I will be, or I will be there howsoever I will be there. What's Moses' thought? Great. Another God I can't know. Like, I will be there however I'll be. Who are you? I don't understand. But then God says, thus shall I say to the Israelites, Yahweh, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob will be with you. Yahweh is the third person of Ayah. I am is Ayah. Yahweh is he is. Do you see the difference? If you don't, I'm going to explain it. Don't worry. Moses goes, wait, how can I call you he is unless I know you? Think about it. You can't say he is love unless you know him. You can't say he is joy unless you know him. This is what God is trying to tell Moses. I want you to know me, Moses. I want to have a relationship with you and the people of Israel. This is not just a God who's up here and unknowable. This is a God who's down here with you, working with you, loving you. And this is what Moses is starting to understand. This is a relationship. Look at verse 15. Go and gather the elders of Israel and say to them, the Lord God of your fathers has appeared to me, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, I have surely marked what is done to you in Egypt. And I have said, I will bring you up from the abuse of Egypt to the land of the Canaanite and the Hittite and the Amorite and the Perizzite and the Hivite and the Jebusite, to a land flowing with milk and honey. And they will heed your voice, and you shall come, you and the elders of Israel, to the king of Egypt. And together you shall say to him, the Lord, Yahweh, God of the Hebrews, because we're talking to Pharaoh outside, happened upon us. And so let us go pray 3 days' journey into the wilderness that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. Notice this. The request to Pharaoh is for Israel to go into the wilderness for 3 days to sacrifice. A lot of people miss that. The initial ask was not, let my people go completely. It was, let us go and sacrifice the Lord our God. That's very important. Let's continue. And I, on my part, know that the king of Egypt, I know, because I'm God, right? God knew. I know that he will not let you go except through a strong hand. Hand imagery. Here it comes. Ready? And I will send out my hand and strike Egypt with all my wonders that I shall do in his midst. And afterward will he send you out. And I will grant this people favor in the eyes of Egypt. And so when you go, you will not go empty-handed. But each woman will ask of her neighbor and of the sojourner in her house ornaments of silver and ornaments of gold and robes, and you shall put them on your sons and on your daughters, and you shall despoil Egypt. Well, that's exactly what happens. They leave and they get a treasures galore. It's like, what? But what we're seeing here is this hand imagery. And we're going to notice very quickly that God's hand acts through Moses' hand. And we're going to see this. God is using Moses, but Moses isn't the one doing it. He doesn't have power. It's God working through him. And you're going to see this happen as we move forward. Look at chapter 4. And Moses answered. So all this has happened. He's like, this is great. And look what Moses says. And Moses answered and said, but look, they will not believe me, nor will they heed my voice, for they say the Lord did not appear to you. Moses, hesitation. He struggles with this. Hesitation. He's still struggling with trusting God, and he hesitates. And it's crazy because later down the road, he's going to get to the point where he literally stands up and confronts God. He's going to get so bold. Like, so bold that even Job wasn't that bold. And Job went, oh, like too much. Like, Moses is going to get that bold. But he's so hesitant right now. And God's got some work to do with him. He's got to draw some things out of him to get him to this place. And that's what he's trying to do. Let's continue to verse 2 of chapter 4. And the Lord said to him, what is that in your hand? And he said, a staff. And he said, fling it to the ground. And he flung it to the ground and became a snake. And Moses fled from it. And the Lord said to Moses, reach out your hand and grasp its tail. By the way, worst thing you should ever do is grasp a snake by the tail. All right? That's how you get bit. All right? That's the worst thing to do. If anything, you grab it really close to the head by the neck and then hopefully push down and paralyze it a little bit. But look what happens. And he reached out his hand and held it, and it became a staff in his grip. So that they will believe that the Yahweh, the Lord God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has appeared to you. Now, this snake scene, I truly believe, is meant to allude to what's about to happen in Numbers chapter 21. In Numbers chapter 21, the Israelites are wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. They've sinned against God, and God sends vipers, these poisonous snakes, to bite the Israelites. And then God says, Moses, take this bronze serpent, put it on a pole, and anyone who looks on it will be healed. The exact same thing that Jesus talks about to Nicodemus in John chapter 3. Just as Moses put a bronze serpent on the pole, so too the Son of Man must be lifted up, so that people may only need to look on him to be healed. The cross. Jesus is alluding to the cross. It comes from Numbers 21 and is mentioned all the way back here in Exodus. It's this beautiful imagery of recognizing that, and by the way, that's where our symbol comes from for the health profession, right? This. It comes from this healing that happens. Let's continue in verse 6. And the Lord said further to him, bring, pray, your hand into your bosom. Notice, he doesn't even wait for Moses to retort this time. He just goes, nope, I'm going to go ahead and give you another one, right? And he puts his hand into his bosom and brought it back out, and it looked like it was blanched like snow, basically leprous. And he said, put your hand back into your bosom. And he put it back into his bosom and brought it out, and look, it became back like his own flesh. And so should they not believe you, and should they not heed the voice of the first sign, they will believe the voice of the second sign. But he doesn't stop there. Look what he says here. And should it be that they do not believe even both of these signs and do not heed your voice, you shall then take the water of the Nile and pour it on the dry land, and the water that you take from the Nile will become blood on the dry land. Wait, that's the first plague. Yeah. Because here's what's happening. God is already anticipating unbelief. He's like, I anticipate that there will be unbelief. But here's the thing, and this is something that we miss. The first plague wasn't just for the Egyptians. It was also a sign to the Israelites. This is your God. Church, again, we've taken our theology and put it over here for a second while I read this literarily. Can I make the point that maybe, possibly, the point of the plagues is not about only judgment, but also the point of the plagues is for people to have belief and obedience in God? The plagues are there to bring you to belief and to bring you to obedience. And we're actually going to see this next week when we go through the plagues. We're going to go through all 10 plagues next week. And when we go through, we're going to see even the Egyptians say, God's finger this is. And they're going to start obeying God and not Pharaoh. You're going to see it. It's going to happen. And that's what God's trying to do, this dual penitential narrative. Look at verse 10. And Moses said, please, my Lord, no man of words, I misspelled that, words am I, not at any time in the past nor now since I have spoken to your servant, for I am heavy-mouthed and heavy-tongued. And the Lord said to him, who gave man a mouth? Or who makes him mute or deaf or sighted or blind? Is it not I, the Lord, Yahweh? And now go, and I myself will be, Ayah, with your mouth, and will instruct you what to say. Church, little fun tidbit. God doesn't call the qualified. He qualifies the called. That's how God works. And we see it all the way in Exodus, and we see it constantly throughout Scripture. God qualifies the called. He doesn't call the qualified. So just remember that. God can work through you no matter what it is. You just have to trust him. And if he's called you there, he will give you what you need. But we're also seeing here, I will be with your mouth, right? What are we seeing? We're seeing what we talked about before, like the hand of Moses is really the hand of God, and the mouth of Moses is really the mouth of God, because God is with his hands and God is with his mouth. And he's going to instruct him what to say. But then, of course, Moses is wrestling with hesitation. So what happens in verse 13? And he said, please, my Lord, pray by the hand of him, you would send. And the wrath of the Lord flared up against Moses. We're going to come back to that. You can underline that if you want. But the wrath of the Lord flared up against Moses. And he said, is there not Aaron the Levite, your brother? I know that he can indeed speak. And what's more, look, he's coming out to meet you. And when he sees you, his heart will rejoice. And you shall speak to him and put words in his mouth. And I myself will be with your mouth and with his mouth. And I will instruct you both on what you should do. That's your hands. And he will speak for you to the people. And so he will be a mouth for you. And you will be for him like a God. All right, let's talk about that. Because you're probably going, what just happened here? Let's rewind for a second. This is sort of what just played out. God says, Moses, do this. And Moses goes, well, I don't want to do this. God says, Moses, just go do it. And then Moses goes, well, I really don't want to do it. And then the wrath of the Lord flared. And what did God do? Moses, you're done? No. He met him where he was at. The wrath of the Lord flares, and God meets him where he's at. Isn't that interesting? That is long-suffering and patient. That's not a God of quick judgment. That's a God of long-suffering. A God who loves so much that even when he flares with anger, he meets them where they're at. That's how God works. And he says, Moses, you will be basically my prophet, my hands, my mouth. But Aaron will be your hands and your mouth. And by doing this, you're sort of like a god to him. You're not literally a god. You are like a god to him. In the sense that Moses now has become the mediator between God and man. In this instance. Which is very interesting. And notice that wasn't God's plan. God wanted to just work through Moses. But Moses just struggled so much with this hesitation. And God said, fine, I'll meet you where you're at. And you'll mediate between me and Aaron then. And he will do what you tell him to do, and I will be with your mouth and with his mouth. I will be with your hands, and he will do. Because you're heavy-mouthed and heavy-tongued. That's where we get this idea that he has a stutter. Let's move on to verse 17. And this staff you shall take in your hand with which you will do the signs. And Moses went and returned to Jether. That's not a typo. Jether was another word that was used in the Hebrew Bible for Jethro. Jethro, his father-in-law. And he said to him, let me go pray and return to my brothers who are in Egypt, that I may see whether they still live. And Jethro said, go in peace. And the Lord said to Moses in Midian, go, return to Egypt, for all the men who sought your life are dead. And Moses took his wife and his sons and mounted them on the donkey, and he returned to the land of Egypt. And Moses took God's staff in his hand, and the Lord said to Moses, pay really close attention to these next few words from God, because this is very important. When you set out to return to Egypt, see all the portents that I have put in your hand, and do them before Pharaoh. But I, on my part, shall toughen his heart, and he will not send the people away. And you shall say to Pharaoh, thus said the Lord, my son, my firstborn is Israel. And I said to you, send off my son that he may worship me, and you refuse to send him off. And look, I am about to kill your son, your firstborn. Church, we already know the end of the drama in advance. God's made it clear. Pharaoh, you didn't let my son go and worship, and now I'm killing yours. Just as you killed all those sons, I'm now going to kill yours. That should make us be just flabbergasted at how long it takes Pharaoh to get it. And we're going to see this next week when we look at the Ten Commandments, or not the Ten Commandments, sorry, the 10 plagues. Goodness gracious, even his soothsayers got it by plague 6. Like, he just doesn't get it. And we're going to talk about that in a second, because in there was a very interesting phrase. But I, on my part, shall toughen his heart, or harden his heart. There are 3 phrases that are used here. The Lord toughened Pharaoh's heart, he hardened his heart, and Pharaoh's heart hardened. And sometimes we look at that and we go, so what I'm seeing is there are times that Pharaoh hardens his own heart, and then there are times that God stops him from repenting. And from the rabbinic tradition, that is very not the direction that the text is trying to take you. You see, Pharaoh considers himself a god, above reproach and very powerful. And when he comes up against Moses, a mere mortal, yet Moses can outdo him. This is, in fact, when Pharaoh hardens his heart. He goes, this mere mortal, I'm a god. He can outdo me? And he hardens his heart. Can I pose to you, Pharaoh is hardening his heart because God is hardening his heart? Let me explain what I mean by that. You might be saying, how is God hardening his heart? There's no easy way to say this outside of God outdoes him in the plague competitions. Straight up outdoes him. And God shows Pharaoh that he is a more powerful God than Pharaoh is. That's how God is hardening his heart, by beating him. And Pharaoh can't stand it, especially because he doesn't see God. He sees this mere stuttering mortal who's standing in front of him, beating him. He goes, seriously? And he's not just beating him, he's beating his soothsayers, his sages, everyone, his sorcerers. And what happens here, what we see is this tragedy that Pharaoh is stuck in a rivalry with God, but God won't relent because God is God. And he's trying to get Pharaoh to come back, to turn away. And it's almost impossible. And we'll talk more about that next week. Let's go to chapter 4, verse 28, the end of the chapter. And Moses told Aaron all the Lord's words with which he sent him, and all the signs with which he charged him. And Moses and Aaron with him went, and they gathered the elders of the Israelites, and Aaron spoke all the words that the Lord had spoken to Moses, and he did the signs before the people's eyes, and the people believed and heeded that the Lord had singled out the Israelites and that he had seen their abuse. And they did obeisance and bowed down. Well, that was easy. What was Moses so worried about? But here's the thing. We could end the story there and say, look at that, they obeyed, it's great, done. But no, as we know, what's going to happen The Israelites are going to grumble. They're going to complain. They're going to turn away from God. God's going to go, this is your people, Moses. And he's going, no, it's actually your people, God. And they're going to have this back and forth because of the obedience factor. And this is what we're going to see all throughout Exodus as we continue. And as we go to the 10 plagues, it's going to start to become way more clear, not only what God is trying to do through the plagues. And it's not just like, there's so much happening with the plagues. There's the fact that the plagues are going against the Egyptian gods. There's the fact that the plagues are showing the power over Pharaoh and the soothsayers. But there's also the fact that the plagues are clearly showing a progression, that God is warning them, if you don't stop, look what I'm going to do. And it's very clear when you start to look at every single plague and what's happening. And God is trying to warn them. He's being patient with them and saying, I love you, Egyptians. I want you to come to me. I created you. But you don't get it. And you're choosing to serve Pharaoh, and we'll talk about this next week, instead of serving me. And Pharaoh sees himself as a god, but I am the true God, and you're missing it. And there's so much that I'm so excited to get into starting next week as we go into the plagues. But I think that's a good place to stop for this week. To see, in the beginning, the Israelites agree. They are all, think about that for a second. They are all for it. Moses saw God. Moses and Aaron are God's mouthpiece. Here we go. Here comes redemption. And it's not going to be that long before they start cursing out Moses and Aaron and going, how dare you? I wish I was back in Egypt, right? It's so crazy how quick we as people can flip, right? We experience God in such an amazing way, and then all of a sudden, one thing happens and we just totally forget. And then we turn the completely opposite direction. And that's really the warning of Exodus. It's trying to warn us to, this penitential narrative is trying to warn us, keep the fear of God. Because when you keep the fear of God, you will then obey God, and you will turn from your ways and follow his ways. That's what we're called to do.